Joined now by Vicki McKenna for CultureCast. Vicki, great to see you this week.
Good to see you, Duke.
Well, I think we're seeing the metastasization of the cancer of big government now. They have now, in a number of ways, decided that the American people themselves are the enemy. And what's good for progressives is bad for conservatives and vice versa. Let's just start with an obvious example. We found out this week, I should say, that the federal agencies now, the Department of Justice, are going to send federal goons to deal with moms and dads who are protesting critical race theory. This is an unbelievable fascist overreach. Talk a little bit about what's going on here.
So the DOJ under Merrick Garland, remember when this guy was described as a moderate, is going to be using, I believe it's 7 different sub agencies under the DOJ umbrella to investigate domestic extremism and terrorism being committed against school board members. What examples is the Department of Justice giving? Are they actually citing examples where someone tried to pipe bomb a school board member's mailbox or something like that? No, it is parents who show up at school board meetings, take their 3 minutes of time that they are allotted, and are angry about their children being used as lab rats for social experimentation by infusing the toxic poison of critical race theory or whatever it goes by in those schools, telling school board members they're terrible representatives of the people, saying that we pay taxes, these are our children, we have a say. You know, really alarming and incredibly incendiary things like this, or complaining that their children are being hijacked for medical experimentation in masks, or using masks or vaccine mandates to try to force parents to knuckle under. That's what the Department of Justice has now broadly defined as a category. They are going to be hunting for domestic extremists and domestic terrorists. And by the way, this comes after the left-wing National Association of School Boards demands that the government use the Patriot Act to put parents who are upset about what is going on in their children's awful schools in jail.
Yeah, and this is just one example of many of this kind of double standard overreach. We were watching this weekend where Christine Sinema committed the cardinal sin of bucking the Democrat trend. She was not going to go along with the $3.5 trillion, which really is really $10 trillion program of Biden. And so you have activists, not even college kids, activists wandering onto college campuses to harass her while she was in the bathroom. And feminist groups from coast to coast say, this is wonderful, this is fantastic. A woman being assaulted in a bathroom, as long as she's a Republican, that's wonderful. Meanwhile, the minute you say one thing at an abortion clinic, or you challenge the pro-choice issues, suddenly you are anti-women and you're doing actual violent harm to women.
Anything that the people support is necessarily the enemy of the progressives. Understand that if the majority of people want to have their schools stop teaching the poison and racism of CRT, they're the problem. Christian Sinema seems to think that we shouldn't be spending $10 trillion we don't have in order to prop up the third world and make sure we institutionalize inflation so that people's retirements are worth less and less every year. How dare she? But that's against the progressives, and so she's an enemy of the people. But think about this, Duke. You have all of these lawful citizens who show up at school board meetings, and we're all telling them to do this. Show up at your local boards of government. Go to your city council. Go to your school board meeting. All of these lawful tax-paying citizens of the United States are now being relegated into a category of potential domestic terrorists. Meanwhile, the illegal aliens stalking Kirsten Sinema in a bathroom at the airport, who are mad at her because she's not voting for more money to prop up illegal aliens who haven't been paying those taxes, but are taking advantage of the system in the United States. They're the good guys. And it goes even further than that. It's not even just the obvious comparative hypocrisy. If any politician or any person on the right is attacked, it's necessarily a good thing. Steve King got shot by a leftist, and the leftists couldn't find their way to condemn the violence. Rand Paul was attacked and assaulted by leftists, and the left could not find a way to condemn the violence. But if there is sternly worded letters or strong language at school board meetings, by golly, we need to rack those people up. Perhaps extraordinary rendition is appropriate in these cases.
Hey, Guantanamo's empty now. All the thugs are leading the
Good
Taliban.
point.
After the break, I want to pick this last point up again. Back again with Vicki McKenna and CultureCast. Vicki made a brilliant point. I'll give you one more example of it. All last summer, we saw agitators and Antifa and Black Lives Matter organizations burning, looting, pillaging, assaulting, and this was protest, right? And meanwhile, you had in January
righteous protest, yes.
Just righteous protest in the middle of a COVID pandemic when you and I couldn't go to church. If we had turned out in our devil masks and started throwing bricks, suddenly that would have been legitimate protest, right? Meanwhile, one time on January 6th, a handful of idiots wandered around without being armed, wandered around the Capitol building without being invited in, and many of them, 9 months later, are still sitting in jail cells.
Yeah.
Wow.
Shocking. It actually is pretty stunning. Nobody's getting arrested for the ongoing violence in Portland. Portland is an occupied territory by an enemy force hostile to America, and nothing. Seattle, the same thing. There is random criminal violence that breaks out every single weekend. Not far from us in Chicago, you have a district attorney that is not going to be charging homicides as long as the homicides are committed by the right people. But yeah, you've got a handful of folks. Most of the people who went to Washington, D.C. on January 6th were grandmas, grandpas, veterans from Vietnam, who were just there to protest their government, to protest the outcome of the election, to demand redress of their grievances, all of these things that are covered in the First Amendment. Some of them walked through an open door that wasn't barricaded and essentially were escorted in by Capitol guards who are actually nothing more than tourist security guards in Washington, D.C. for the most part. And next thing you know, we've got an armed insurrection that must result in 650 people being investigated and charged, and about 60 of them sitting in solitary confinement. By the way, if you look at the video, and there were a handful of thugs who were dressed in black, looked nothing like the actual protesters who were there, wearing helmets. It looked an awful lot like Antifa, quite frankly. None of them have been charged. None of them who were wearing the helmets and slamming crowbars into windows. There were a handful of those people, but none of them were charged, which of course has some of us out here wondering how many of them were actual federal agents.
Well, you also have a Capitol security guard who blew a woman's head off, who was unarmed, in a room full of unarmed people. And a couple of weeks ago,
he feared for his death.
He feared for his life by an unarmed woman, right? When the only people who had guns was the security staff. And no one's bothered by that either. Can you imagine Black Lives Matter?
Completely okay.
Can you imagine Black Lives Matter if a white cop had killed a black woman in a very similar protest in a federal building? What would we be hearing right now? That cop would be on trial for his life.
You bet.
Even in a little small college like Emerson College this week, we had a remarkable situation where a group of Republican kids were handing out buttons challenging and calling out the Chinese government. One button said something to the effect of, the Chinese government, Chinese communism is SUS, which is, I think, a euphemism for Chinese communism sucks. Well, what did the university do? They immediately launched an investigation because to criticize the Chinese government, a government that has 1.1 million Uyghur Muslims in slave camps, to challenge the Chinese government is anti-Asian hate.
Think about this. The Uyghurs that are being held in slave camps are also being used to harvest organs for the for-profit organ market. And nobody seems to think that's a big deal either. There's actual genocide going on in communist China, but nobody seems to think that's anything we should concern ourselves with. No. It was that handful of Republican kids on campus who thought it was still okay to express their First Amendment rights and criticize a sworn enemy of the United States. Not anymore, Duke. Things are absolutely upside down. But going back to the Ashley Babbitt murder, a police officer shot an unarmed woman. If that same black police officer had shot an unarmed black woman who happened to not be a Trump supporter, but was a Black Lives Matter supporter, the city would have burned down. The Capitol would have been torn apart stone by stone, and the left elite media would have cheered every single second of it.